Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Davina Durgana from Walk Free at the Minderoo Foundation, and I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you today about how we find today's slaves, lessons learned from over a decade measuring modern slavery. First, a little bit about our foundation. The Minderoo Foundation is one of Asia's largest philanthropies, and we've committed over $1.5 billion Australian dollars towards a range of global initiatives. We work on not just modern slavery, which is our Walk Free initiative, but also Thrive by Five, which is promoting childhood development, research, supporting research and entrepreneurship, Flourishing Oceans, looking at restoring ocean health, Generation One for Indigenous parity. We're looking to make cancer non-fatal, and we're looking at supporting the arts among an array of other initiatives related to COVID, and also now taking on big technology. But this is the number we're all here to talk about. 40.3 million people around the world were victims of modern slavery on any given day in 2016. This number is the culmination of years of effort between Walk Free and the International Labor Organization, and it represents millions of dollars of survey research and the very best statistical efforts to try to figure out what the rate of modern slavery was at the time of this research. In particular, we look at 24.9 million people in forms of forced labor, and we'll talk about the top industries, but importantly, 15.4 million people in forced marriage. Now, this is a really important policy point. Measurement isn't just about measurement. By including these populations in these numbers, we are actually defining the policy priorities for the community. And so the inclusion of 15.4 million people in forced marriage is really important because it covers a form of modern slavery that isn't often included when talking about other forms of forced labor. The top forms of forced labor that we encountered are domestic servitude, sex industries, construction, manufacturing, agriculture, and fishing. But specifically, what makes our job really interesting, what I love about my work, is that I'm trying to find the hidden populations in uncontrolled spaces. So typically that means forced conscription and child combatants in Eritrea, Burundi, Rwanda, and now, of course, in Venezuela's border communities. We have lots of recruitment happening, again, of course, in Colombia for ethnic conflict. There's illegal logging in the Amazon. There's a really exciting work happening on the deep seas as it relates to slavery. And a lot of our recent work with Customs and Border Patrol has really looked at using importation bans to ensure that these types of modern slavery are addressed and done so at scale so that the impact of our policy efforts are really pronounced. We have urban street gangs in Southside Chicago and regular migration and refugees, of course, and that's even more pronounced now post-Afghanistan, post-Syria, and post-Venezuela. In my opinion, irregular migration and refugees, particularly related to climate displacement, will be a huge source of our focus in the future, and it's something that I'm very eager to address, especially from a risk modeling perspective. The Global Slavery Index, which is our flagship report, looks at three major dimensions. It's prevalence of modern slavery, government responses, what can be done to address this, and vulnerability. Specifically, the two I'll talk about today are prevalence and vulnerability. Those are the ones that build the most on our statistical modeling and reinforce our estimates of modern slavery. Initially, for the first global estimate of modern slavery, keeping in mind that another one is coming out soon, so you'll have even more data points, even more countries that are a part of this, we used 48 countries as a sample of the world. There are always limitations to the assumptions that we make, and in this case, surveys are contraindicated in developed countries, which is why we've been collaborating with, following the leadership of our colleagues such as Kevin Bales and others on multiple systems estimation in developed countries, and I'll touch on that a little bit in a short while. But fundamentally, we looked at our survey research to measure forced marriage and forced labor exploitation, both in adults and children. And of course, forced sexual exploitation is very difficult to find, but we did collaborate with colleagues at the International Organization for Migration for service data that they may have in certain regions. But of course, our surveys are not just quantitative. We have we have free response sections that are called verbatim. So this is when people can, in their own words, describe the conditions of slavery that they've experienced. This is really helpful for us because it allows us not just to verify the forms of coercion that the interviewers have identified, but it also allows us to really understand what the context of slavery is for these individuals. One of the things that's really fascinating to me is that all of these conditions are of slavery, and yet severity, experiential differences are so varied. And that's one of the more challenging parts of our work, is understanding how a global definition can fit so many different contexts. When I oversee our risk and vulnerability modeling, what that means is that I create these broad risk models for every country in the world. And that allows us to group countries together, in that we will not have survey research or even multiple systems estimates for every country. That is not just prohibitively expensive, but it's also quite difficult. And so what we do is we create these risk models to try to help us understand the relationship of some of these countries to other ones. And that is fundamentally one of the things that really is very helpful as we move forward. The models that we've constructed are based on open source data for the most part. And we are now this year looking at constructing regional vulnerability models as well, for more specificity and different data sources that may not be universally available, but may be relevant in a specific region. The 5 areas that we typically cover are governance issues, which is predominantly one of the major indicators, a lack of basic needs, inequality, disenfranchisement within a society, and the effects of conflict. Of course, keeping in mind that if a country is experiencing active conflict, that often will take precedence over other forms of instability. Once we use these global models and our survey data, we understand how to predict modern slavery by creating these individual and country level risk factors. And we start at the regional level. Then from the regional level, we apportion out the number of slaves that we believe are justified based on our models in each country. We also have an invaluable resource that isn't quite directly quantitative, but is incredibly useful from a policy perspective and many other ways. This is our government response database. You can go to our website and look at any country in the world that we cover and understand not just what they have on the books, but also their effectiveness in implementation. We actively seek out survey responses from countries that allow us to understand exactly what the local service providers would say about some of the protections that are being listed and whether or not they actually are effective. But it isn't just research. So the Global Slavery Index doesn't stand alone. We also have the Global Freedom Network that looks at galvanizing faith communities, which is critically important because in many countries where the governments are not well financed or unable to provide the type of support that's needed, we will have faith communities that step up and provide that assistance. We have the Bali process, government and business forum, that looks at supply chain transparency and organizes business and government leaders to make sure that they can use this effectively. We also have the Freedom Fund, which is an organization that we support based in the United Kingdom that hotspots or trials interventions at smaller scale before investing in the large scale. And of course, Freedom United has more to do with public communication of these findings. One of the most compelling elements of modern slavery to me is that traffickers are rational actors. And so that means that we can understand more or less what's motivating their behavior, profit. So when we think about this and we think about importing risk into the United States, one of the things that's really critical is that we have laws in the US and executive orders that allow for us to prevent the importation of goods suspected to be made with forced and child labor. That said, all the G20 countries still do this, and they do this at an enormous scale. So what that means is that these protections just are not enough. We need more transparency about where our electronics, garments, fish, cocoa, and timber are coming from. And specifically, we need to know how they are entering the United States. I also want to take an opportunity to touch on our stacked odds report. This came out this past year at the UN General Assembly. And what was really important about it was that, and this is in 2020, and what was really important about this is that it effectively put into context this number of 71% of the respondents we identified being women and girls. Disproportionately, women and girls face more risk to modern slavery, and we had to kind of understand exactly why. So we went through an extensive process of qualitative research to really understand what was putting women and girls at such a disadvantage. Specifically, what we looked at were some of the ways that 1 in every 130 women and girls would be living in modern slavery. And the way that we do that is we look at what factors contributed to this state of affairs. Fundamentally, it comes down to variations of gender inequality. Political, social, economic, religious rights are all affected by gender insofar as women are often given less agency and less ability to choose their own lives. These gender biases, of course, are then enshrined in the laws and policies that dictate their lives. And so now we start to see how this widespread sociocultural value that's placed on boy children over female children can contribute to higher rates of modern slavery. Specifically, from birth to conception to infancy, we're already seeing son preference. So of course we know that in many countries, such as China and India, son preference has meant that there are just generations of missing women, missing girl children, that now mean that there are brides being trafficked throughout all of those regions. Of course, when we get into childhood, that also means that the risk of child marriage and the risk of forced labor increase, especially as they're not necessarily being prioritized for educational opportunities. In adolescence, the risk of child marriage, forced labor, and forced marriage, of course, become even higher, and even less girl children are prioritized for educational opportunities. And of course, forced sex starts to become a bigger problem, although it always is one. In adulthood, we see that women are constantly, in every country, in every culture and socioeconomic background, are doing often unpaid domestic work. And that inhibits their ability to productively participate in the labor force. And then, of course, there are women at these ages that are paid less than men or valued less than men for their work, and therefore also experience poverty at higher rates. Finally, in late adulthood, due to land tenure rights and the inability to hold these longer jobs and careers, or perhaps sacrificing them for household duties and family responsibilities, you're now seeing widows that are also highly vulnerable and exploited in all industries. Also, it's really important that we recognize that it isn't just that children and girl children have less access to educational opportunities and therefore end up in worse paying jobs or situations in poverty and more modern slavery. They also have less access to medical care. They are also much more likely to live in poverty for their whole lives. They're going to have prevention in inheriting land and assets when other male relatives have opportunities. And so we suggest that we need to improve access to education for women and girls. We need to improve economic and vocational opportunities for women and girls. And we need to work within and with communities to change harmful gender-based attitudes. Overall, this has been one of the most compelling elements of our work, is that we have strived to provide the best estimates of modern slavery and then immediately looked at the opportunities we have to address that from a policy perspective. So one of the really exciting things about this conference is that we are bringing really policy and academia to the fore of our efforts in anti-trafficking. So with that, please reach out anytime with any questions, and it has been an honor to address you today.